I don't like calling the events of 9/11 the terrorist attack on the U.S. I know that's what the media and millions of people call it, but I don't. And it's not because I have no concern for the 2,982 lives lost in the attacks. I actually have more of a connection with this day and those people than most of the folks who were chomping at the bit to bomb another country over it had. See, my aunt worked in the Pentagon, and she was there on that day, on September 11th, 2001. I was sitting in my office at a small market research firm on Connecticut Avenue. It was clear that day, and I was doing some kind of mundane paperwork while listening to the radio, like I did every day. The announcer began to say that there were reports of a plane hitting the World Trade Center in New York City. Then more frantic reports of a plane hitting the Pentagon came in. And then I looked up from my work at that moment because I was looking out of the window to see if I could see smoke in the distance. I wasn't even sure if I could see the Pentagon from where I was on Upper Connecticut Avenue in Northwest D.C., but I was frantic to not see smoke, because if I didn't, then that would mean that the reports were not true and that my Aunt Clara was okay. I turned to other stations on the radio, and all reported the same thing. A plane had hit the Pentagon and both towers now of the World Trade Center in New York City. Then my phone began to ring. My grandmother in Jarrett, Virginia called, my uncle in Southfield, Michigan, my younger aunt in Richmond, Virginia, my cousin, my aunt's son, and my aunt's partner, Uncle Junie, here in D.C., my dad in Emporia, Virginia. Everybody in my family from all over the place were calling me to find out where I was, if I was okay, and if I had heard from Aunt Clara. We all knew she worked at the Pentagon, and so that's when I knew the reports were true. I went into the bathroom and I lost my breakfast. I worked hard to keep the anxiety attack that was trying to pull me under at bay. We turned the television on in the conference room and were watching the news coverage, and I sat in the back of the conference room, silently praying and trying so hard not to cry, while listening to my bosses, all white men, joke about how the traffic restrictions that were being put in place was going to ruin their poker night. I almost lost my job that day. I thought I had lost my aunt. But at around 4 o'clock, she called me. She said that she was all right. She was at home. She had escaped the collapsed side of the Pentagon with some of her coworkers by grabbing a hold of each other's clothes in the dark and following a voice that no one ever identified out of the hot, smoky darkness to safety. She said that she was covered in soot, but because no one seemed to be providing a way for the survivors to get home fast enough for her, she got on the Metro bus like she always did. She talked about how people stared at her sitting there, covered in soot, riding the bus home. My aunt has never talked about that day again. She refused to attend or participate in any commemoration events since, and she still won't. As far as I know, she's never received support or medical screening or anything after that day, although she certainly breathed in plenty of whatever it was in the walls of the Pentagon and the plane that was flown into it, and fuel and other chemicals that were dislodged and burned. What she also never did, though, was celebrate this country bombing the hell out of another country in retribution for 9/11. She sure didn't get any help, medical, mental, or otherwise, for surviving this horror, which, considering how much money was spent to kill so many people in Afghanistan for 20 years, that never sat right with her. On the same day, miles away in Newark, New Jersey, Abdul-Shahid Luqman, who I didn't even know at that time, was an imam at a mosque in Newark where the Black community watched as the planes hit the World Trade Center towers and eventually fell. He often told me about the ambivalence that many Black people in that community had about the event. They were sad about the loss of life, absolutely, but they understood that whatever those folks who committed this act were mad about, it didn't have anything to do with Black people. There was no celebrating the attacks among those people, he said, but Abdus, ever the observer of political history and foreign policy, did say that he conversed with a lot of folks out there that day on the highway watching as the smoke continued to billow from the ruined buildings, talking about the things the U.S. government did around the world to other people that were inevitably going to come back on it here. And they all believed that this is what they were seeing. But when the identity of the hijackers were revealed days later and it was known that they were Muslims of some sort, all the God-fearing Americans who were so united in their humanity for their fallen brethren started attacking Muslims in this country in their growing Islamophobic frenzy. But as Abdus also pointed out, not the black Muslims in Newark. He told me that one white man tried to put his hands on one Muslim sister on the bus one day, tried to pull her hijab off. Not only was he not successful, but he got his behind handed to him by other riders on the bus, mostly black and not all Muslim. And when the community found out what happened, Muslim brothers were on every bus protecting women. White people tried to drive through the black Muslim communities in New Jersey and harass and intimidate people, but they weren't met with exhortations that these Muslims were not like those Muslims that did that terrible thing and that these Muslims love America too. No, they didn't see Muslims in these black neighborhoods waving little American flags and singing God Bless America out of fear, a very real fear because Muslims were being assaulted across this country. What they saw was black Muslims with weapons, from fists to guns, ready to defend themselves. None of these people celebrated the 20 years of death the U.S. unleashed on Afghanistan either, even as their mosques and their homes were surveilled and they were put on the government's no-fly and terrorist watch lists in the aftermath, like Abdus was, until he had to write to the New Jersey governor to get his and other Muslims' names off of it. So here we are, at the end of that 20-year war, commemorating the event that was used to justify it, and I fear we still do not recognize that we are and always have been a country that is and always has been at war, but at war mostly with its own people. Follow Luqman Nation on patreon.com/LuqmanNation for lots of great content.